Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this launch event of my book, Head, Hand, Heart. The struggle for, goodness, remind me what the subtitle is. The struggle for dignity and status in the 21st century. We have got an hour and a quarter to have a debate about my book, and I'm very pleased to say we've got 4 other people who are going to be commenting on it. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to have comments from Daniel Susskind, who is the author of A World Without Work. Then Andrew Adonis is going to speak, followed by Madeleine Bunting and Nick Timothy. So I think probably in that order. Let me just give you a very brief overview. I mean, I assume that most of you won't have had the chance to see the book. It only came out last week. In some ways, it's a kind of follow-up to my book of 3 years ago, The Road to Somewhere. It's obviously, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, without being falsely modest, I don't think this is a particularly original book, but I hope I've sort of captured something of current political and social anxieties. I actually, on its lack of originality, I mean, just a brief little anecdote. When I had a month at the Institut der Wissenschaft von Menschen in Vienna back in March last year, when I wrote had a first stab at a couple of chapters. I did a kind of introductory overview that's a little bit like the current chapter 1, and I showed it. I got quite friendly with a political scientist from Bulgaria who was also at the institute, and I showed her this chapter, and a couple of days later she commented on it and said, well, I really enjoyed it. I thought there was a lot of good stuff in there, but you realize it's all in Plato's Republic. So I did actually spend some of my summer holiday this year trying to read Plato's Republic. I did find Fleischmann is in Trouble rather more easy to read. But as I say, I mean, this book pulls together lots of current anxieties about fairness, inequality, the limits of meritocracy, even kind of slow growth and productivity, the growth of a sort of huge cognitive bureaucracy, political concern about the 50% who don't go to university, the belief that perhaps we overexpanded higher education, the way that various things had just got out of kilter. I mean, even prior to the pandemic, a feeling that both economically, slow growth, low productivity, despite higher investment than ever before in elite research universities, and more people going to university than ever before. Cultural disruption, the kind of my value divides, my anywhere somewhere divide, which again has a very strong educational aspect to it, and perhaps a political kind of out of alignment too that we've created in recent decades. What we might call a kind of mass elite. I mean, a very large proportion of school leavers now go on to university. About 35% of adult Brits are now graduates. We've gone from a very narrow elite when I was at university to a mass elite, but that mass elite, or quite a large proportion of that mass elite, is not moving into the relatively highly paid, highly respected jobs that they perhaps expected, and that's creating a sort of crisis of expectations. I think one could arguably see things like the Bernie Sanders movement, even the kind of Corbyn momentum movement, as expressions of that sort of frustrated expectation. I mean, I think perhaps that the other point I want to make in this brief introduction is that when I started writing the book, it felt quite idealistic in a way. I mean, this interest in kind of rebalancing society along these 3 sets of aptitudes of the head, the hand, and the heart. It felt rather, almost kind of slightly new agey, reinforced perhaps by my discovery that head, hand, heart turns out to be the motto of none other than Bedale's school, the famous progressive English private school. But I mean, the basic claim, the basic argument of the book is that we have allocated too much reward and prestige to one cluster of aptitudes, particularly in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and drawn it away, therefore, from other forms of human achievement, human life, human work, that related to hand, manual, technical, craft, and indeed, obviously, heart, emotional labour, caring, and so on. And it's not just this is not just about education. It's about too narrow a notion of what it is to lead a successful life. That successful life has come to mean passing exams at school, going to a good university, getting a good sort of professional cognitive career, and that is something that obviously by definition not everybody can do. It's also the case that there's kind of one ladder up into that. That is the sort of zone of success and indeed safety that most parents still want for their children, for understandable reasons. Particularly in a society where 40% of jobs are now graduate only. So the thing becomes self-reinforcing, and there is a single ladder up into it, which is the modern university. There used to be many more little ladders up, many more kind of a greater sort of pluralism, a greater variety of different forms of recognition and different elites. We've now narrowed it down, but the main point, the reason why I sort of shifted from thinking this was rather an idealistic book to a very hard-headed and practical one, and that what I was writing about was, in a sense, almost bound to happen in some form, is that I think we have now reached peak head. I mean, as I was writing the book, I was reading lots of stuff, including works by Daniel and his father, on the knowledge economy, and it turns out the knowledge economy doesn't need nearly as many knowledge workers as we had once assumed, and indeed had expanded higher education in order to produce. And you can see that also in if you just look at the size of the two highest social classes. If you look at the kind of ONS, I think it's a 7 or 8 class schema, the top two social classes, managerial and professional, higher managerial and professional, and lower managerial and professional, the number of, the proportion of the working population, the adult population in those two social classes was, I think, about 35% in the year 2000, and it's now about 37%. The growth of it has slowed almost to a stop. And you're seeing other signs of the kind of the slowdown in the increase of the cognitive class, in the decline in the graduate income premium. The 1/3 of graduates who are in non-graduate jobs nearly 10 years after graduating, and that's given a very elastic definition of what a graduate job is too. Meanwhile, we have huge skill shortages in the skilled trades, in middling technician type roles, and huge recruitment crises in nursing and social care. So we have, the system has got out of kilter, and we need to rebalance. How we do that is obviously a big and complicated thing. I mean, I think it's sort of, as I say, it's sort of coming anyway. And the extent to which, particularly the kind of reallocation of status is in the gift of politics is obviously a moot point. I mean, it's not. I mean, or politics can make a difference at the margin in some of these things. Some of the answers are quite traditional, sort of social democratic ones. High minimum wages. More as the kind of respect we saw for the mainly non-college educated key workers in the lockdown. But just let me wind up my little contribution, my little introduction, with a couple of, as it were, sort of answers to critics who, David Willetts in particular, who's someone who I've been arguing about, particularly the higher education aspect of this, but not just David Willetts, but other people who argue that I want to roll back. It's all right for you. You're from a very privileged background. Your kids all went to Russell Group universities. You want to roll back these opportunities for other children. Well, I don't at all. I mean, I make the point in the book that I think actually the new universities add more value than many of the Russell Group universities. They are, however, we are sucking far too many people into this undifferentiated expansion of higher education. That, the fact that, all the universities, they're mainly residential. They're 3 or 4 years. They're taught by, the courses are taught by academics, not by teachers. They academicize, a lot of the vocational courses, 40% of courses in British higher education are primarily vocational, but a lot of them are very, very academicized too. And we need much more differentiation, much more flexibility there. And also actually just fewer people going into academic courses at the age of 18 or 19 that they are not, that are not suitable for them, and they're not getting a huge amount out of. And I mean, I think it is worth pointing out that actually, when we had a smaller cognitive class, cognitive elite, back in the 60s and 70s, we also actually had a kind of fairer and more equal society. So the two things are not incompatible. I mean, I think too many people now think that the definition of a kind of fairer society is an ever-expanding cognitive class, a sort of mass elite. And there is a lot to be said for having a bigger elite than, as I say, when I went to college, but there are limits to it. I mean, the point is there is no single scale of worth, and we've developed institutions and a culture which has, as I say, allocated too much prestige to just sort of one form of human activity, and we need to do something about it. Anyway, I look forward to hearing what the 4 panelists are now going to say. I will perhaps then briefly respond to their comments, and then we will have questions and comments from people out there somewhere. Over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be invited to talk at the launch of such an important book. What I want to do in the next few minutes is just share a few thoughts on how the threat of automation, which is one of my particular interests, might interact with the fascinating ideas that are contained in this book. It seems like every day we hear stories of systems and machines that are taking on tasks until recently we thought only human beings alone could ever do. Making a medical diagnosis, and driving cars, drafting legal contracts, and composing music, designing buildings and writing news reports. What does all of this technological progress mean for the vast majority of us for whom our job is our main, if not our only, source of income? I think this question of automation is one of the biggest challenges of our time. And it seems to me that it's also very closely related, very closely intertwined with many of the themes that David explores in this book. So I want to take for granted one of David's central ideas, the desirability of a better balance between head, hand, and heart. And instead I want to look at another really interesting idea, that in David's words, there are trends and forces underway that mean in the 21st century, this rebalancing is not only desirable, but that it might also be more likely. That, again, quoting David, head will soon face a more even contest with hand and heart. And looking at this with the threat of automation in mind, it seems to me that technological change does give us 2 reasons for thinking that this rebalancing is likely, 2 reasons to share in that optimism. But it also gives us, I think, 1 reason to be a little more pessimistic. And this is a far more recent reason, and it just relates to some of the changes that have taken place during the pandemic. The first reason to be optimistic, I think, that this rebalancing will take place is that head is far less protected than it was from the threat of automation. For some time, it was thought that white-collar work, prototypical head work, could not readily be automated. Why? Well, because the conventional wisdom was that if you wanted to build a machine to outperform a particular human being, you had to sit down with a human being, get them to explain to you how it was they did whatever it was you were trying to automate, and then you had to try and capture that human explanation in a set of instructions for a machine to follow. But here's the problem with white-collar work, with head work. It often requires faculties like creativity, judgment, intuition, which are very difficult for us to articulate how it is that we use them. And so it was thought very hard to automate. If a human being cannot explain how it is they perform a particular task, where on earth do we begin, many people thought until recently, in writing a set of instructions for a machine to follow? So just as an example, take medical diagnosis. Sit down with a doctor, get them to explain to you how it is they make a medical diagnosis, and they might be able to give you a few rules of thumb, but ultimately they'd struggle. They'd say things like it requires intuition, judgment, creativity. And because these things are so hard to articulate, it was thought a task like making a medical diagnosis couldn't readily be automated. Now, I think 30 years ago, this view of machine capabilities was right. But today, it's looking shaky, and I think in the future, it's simply going to be wrong. Advances in processing power, data storage capability, and algorithm design, particularly in machine learning, mean that this idea that we have to somehow copy the way that human beings think and reason in order to automate a task that they do no longer applies as much as it did. So again, take the task of medical diagnosis. Recently, a team of researchers at Stanford announced the development of a system that if you give it a photo of a freckle, it will tell you as accurately as leading dermatologists whether or not that freckle is cancerous. How does it do it? How does the system work? It's not trying to copy the judgment, creativity, intuition of a human doctor. It knows, understands nothing about medicine at all. It's got a database of about 130,000 past cases, and it's running essentially a pattern recognition algorithm through all those cases, hunting for similarities between them and the particular photo in question. It's performing the task in an unhuman way, based on the analysis of more possible cases than any human doctor could hope to review in their lifetime. It no longer matters that human beings can't articulate how it is that they perform these tasks when we set out to automate them. And for that reason, it seems to me, a whole realm of activity that had traditionally been done by head workers can now increasingly be automated. The second reason for optimism, for thinking that this rebalancing is going to take place, is not only that head is less protected from automation, but at the very same time, hand and heart have also proven to be very difficult to automate. Now, the latter might be unsurprising. It's relatively well known that tasks that involve some sort of interpersonal interaction, nursing, caring, and so on, are very hard to automate. But the fact that hand activities are also hard to automate is less familiar. And in the field of computer science, it's called Moravec's paradox, that many of the things that human beings find simplest to do with their hands are hardest to automate. And conversely, many of the things that we find most difficult to do with our heads turn out to be relatively easy to automate. So taking these two reasons for optimism together, the fundamental point, and this really does, I think, resonate with the arguments that David's making in the book, is that the formal level of schooling required by a human being to perform a particular task is not always informative as to whether or not that task can be automated, as many people have traditionally thought. Head is far more at risk of automation than is commonly supposed, and hand and heart, in my view, far less so. But I think there's also a reason for pessimism, for thinking that automation might get in the way of this important rebalancing between head and hand and heart. Over the last few decades, as I noted before, head and hand workers have tended to find themselves protected from automation because their roles involve things like personal interaction or manual dexterity, and these properties have proven to be very hard to automate. The cruel irony of the last few months is that these workers, these head and hand workers, have in fact been hardest hit by the pandemic precisely because of those properties. The virus spreads through personal interaction, and it flourishes in the poorly ventilated indoor spaces, factories, plants, machinery, factories, plants, and warehouses, where those workers tend to gather to put their manual dexterity to use. And as a result, what we've seen during the pandemic is that many hand and heart workers have found themselves unable to work. And so to the extent that the pandemic has increased the incentive to automate the work that human beings do, and I think it may have, a machine, after all, cannot catch the virus and pass it on to its co-workers or customers. It's not going to fall ill and have to take time off work. It's not going to have to self-isolate to protect its peers. I think it's likely that these heart and hand workers are going to be the most exposed. They can't readily work in their traditional workplaces, nor can they retreat to a home office and do their job from there instead. So yes, these roles might have been protected from automation in the past, but the incentive to develop technologies to take their place, it seems to me, has strengthened quite a lot over the last few months. And for various reasons, I don't think that incentive is going to vanish anytime soon. And I think this may be a force to dampen some of that optimism about whether or not this rebalancing is going to take place. So those are just a few thoughts then on how the threat of automation might help or hinder our attempt to rebalance head, hand, and heart in the way that David so convincingly and engagingly calls for in this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. You can hear me? Yep. Now we are going to turn to Andrew, if he is there. Could I just say, before Andrew speaks, we want people, if people have comments they want to make, could you raise your Zoom hand, as it were, so that the people organising this session can see that you want to make a comment or ask a question. So now over to you, Andrew.
Well, can I first say this is a great book. I've long been a fan of David's. He never writes a book without having really interesting and stimulating things to say, and this is no exception. It's already started a big debate, and David has a great capacity for getting people to disagree with him, which is what makes it makes debates such fun. And I always, the truth is, as I look at his books, I always about half agree with him, which is true about this one too. And the reason I about half is because he always has a great insight into what's happening.
Uh-oh. Oh dear. But being an unreconstructed Blairite and a centrist and all fantastic ideas or conflicting ideas might which are. Shall we come back to him? Yeah. Andrew, I'm afraid it's
my starting point is usually.
Do you want to just cut the rope? Madeleine, are you there? All right. Is that going to be with everybody? Sorry.
I've got no idea what's going on here. Is it not coming through? Or?
Okay, we're back with Andrew. Sorry, we lost you for a while, but I think we're back with you. We were going to cut the rope and let you go adrift, but and move on to someone else. But
am I with you?
But you're still with us. You're hanging on.
Okay, well, I'll keep my remarks brief because it looks as if we're going to have technical issues, which is a sign that not everything has yet been automated.
Stick to the things you really disagree with.
Let me go straight to my reaction to the book.
Yep.
David is absolutely right, in my view, that we should place more prestige, more investment, and give more intellectual and policy energy to hand and heart. And his elevation of heart as one of his new trinity, I think, is a particularly powerful insight, because people tend to think of head and hand, and he got to the heart concept before we even had COVID-19. I'm very struck, by the way, that the other book I've been reading besides David's in the last 2 days, which is Deborah Mattinson's book on the Red Wall, which for anyone who's looking at these trends in a political context is absolutely vital. Deborah says in these Red Wall seats, which are the 50 or so seats which Labour lost to the Conservatives in the Midlands and the North, with which have got by and large lowish living standards and very much anywhere seats. Indeed, she quotes David's other book in her analysis. She says, and it's very telling, most of the women that she spoke to in her focus groups, and Deborah does focus groups, were one way or another in the caring professions, It's very striking. So the first big insight is the need to give an equality of esteem and all the investment that needs to go into it, to the trinity of head, hand, and heart. But the third is actually to have heart in there as part of the trinity. And I entirely, whereas I think the jury's out on some of what Daniel said about automation. The sectors I know about automation is going to be much slower than people think. We're not having driverless cars anywhere soon. The initial tests had people involved in accidents. There's no regulatory authority in the world that I'm aware of that's proposing to license driverless cars anytime soon. We're still in the lab, essentially, on these things. That's the area I know about. So I think that I don't actually buy the idea that automation is going to be more rapid in the professions and the head space at large than hand and heart. But it clearly is the case, though, that hand and heart have big sectors which are not going to be liable to automation, and they need the investment, the esteem, and the policy behind them, which goes with it. The bit that I disagree with is I don't think it's either desirable or inevitable or likely that the head element of the equation is going to become less. I certainly don't think it's desirable. The graduate premium may have come down somewhat, but it's still high. I meet hardly anyone who's gone to university who doesn't wish that they'd gone to university. It's always an acid test of a decision whether you would want to reverse it. Very few people who go to university wish that they hadn't. Not many parents who have got kids who went to university somehow wish that they hadn't and instead have gone to an FE college. If I could be a bit personal about this, because I've always adopted the view as an education policymaker that on the principle of R.H. Tawney, what the wise parent would wish for their child, so the state should wish for all children. I wished my children to go to university. Both of them went to university. All four of David's children went to university. So, the fact that we don't actually wish and didn't facilitate these other career paths happening for any of those of us close to us, I think is a significant moral and values point that needs to be made. Do I think that it's likely that the numbers will come down? No, not at all. Every time everyone has said that student numbers are going to come down, they've gone up. They were supposed to come down when we had tuition fees, they went up. They were supposed to go down with COVID-19. I've just got in front of me the figures for university starts this year, and they're record levels despite COVID. There was supposed to be a big drop in overseas students coming, but it turns out 80% of those are kept because people are so determined to get to university if they possibly can. The truth of the matter is that almost everyone, not quite everyone, but almost everyone who has the capacity to go on to university in modern societies does so. I think you may have lost me again.
No, we haven't. No, keep going.
The picture changed. Oh, I know what happened, actually. It's when one of my colleagues coughed, the whole screen goes across. I know what happens. And I don't see any sign of that changing. It's also the case that to some extent, David's picture of university life is caricatured. Even in his introduction, he said that the residential university is an outdated model. Well, the figures I've just looked up while he was speaking, 43% of students last year lived at home. The great majority of students who go to the new universities that were called polytechnics don't have the residential university experience. Their cost base is much lower. The courses they study are much more practical, and so on. And that leads me to the third point. Is it desirable that that we have fewer graduates? No, I don't think so. I think what will actually...
He has crashed. All right. Well, I think he said quite enough. We get the idea. Shall we move on to Madeleine? Madeleine, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Well, you'll go then.
Yeah, but poor old Andrew's got chopped off.
Yeah.
Well, David's book is enormously thought-provoking, and there were many, many points that I think I would completely agree with, and I thought were absolutely fascinating. But there were many others that I found really problematic and I completely disagreed with. And it's interesting because David and I have been sort of in some of the same territory. My book that's coming out on October the 1st deals with what David describes as the heart category, labour of love, the crisis of care. So I looked very specifically at this one dimension. And we met on various occasions and swapped a few notes and talked about some of the research we were doing. I have a fundamental problem with categorizing work according to hand, heart, and head. It just does not make sense to me at all. As indeed, I think David acknowledges by the end of the book. But it was like, why do we have to get to the end of the book for that acknowledgement? One of the key arguments in my book is that care has been absurdly romanticized and idealized and feminized and ignored, and basically sort of a profound lack of curiosity as to what care is, which I find extraordinary, because actually if you talk to most women's lives of my sort of age, our lives have been hugely made up with the labour of care. Many of them have got jobs in care, as indeed Andrew very interestingly pointed out in Beyond the Red Wall. But all of us, I would say, just as significant as our working lives has been this other side of our life, which gets very, very little recognition, which is this huge and complex labour of care, whether that's elderly parents or children, or indeed, as many people in my age group are dealing with both at the same time. So my respect for what care entails has been a life journey, really, more and more respect for understanding the complexity of what it takes. Because in my book, I interviewed lots of different forms of carers. I looked at lots of jobs that have elements which are care. And I looked at high status jobs like doctors and talked to them about care. And then I talked to care workers and talked to them. They have very low pay and very low status. But in all of them, what I heard was how much head they had to use. And of course, hand. You know, care is a very, very touch and physical form of work. And that's true of doctors as well as care workers. But what I think we have, and I think this is, I'm afraid, the result of a kind of patriarchal, misogynistic bias against care, which has been denigrated as the work of women. We have failed to understand just that subtle interaction of intelligence and judgment and intuition and the management of risk and creativity. So where David and I landed in exactly the same place in his book is when he has this beautiful paragraph describing the complexity of a bus driver setting off from a bus stop, and his work is described as hand, and yet the complexity of that bus driver, she has to look at the traffic, she has to work out what passengers she has on board, she's managing a lot of risk, and it's immensely important she gets her risk management and judgment absolutely right, otherwise we have pedestrians knocked over, etc. And David acknowledged really there how the categorization collapses with the slightest sort of prodding. So I wonder why the categorization appeals to him. And again, I feel that this is where David is trying to explain something about the elites in our culture. And he did it with Somewhere, Anywheres, and now he's doing it again. But I find it divisive. I'm in agreement with Andrew that somewheres are anywheres, and you know, I never bought into that categorization, and I don't buy into this one. I simply don't know what he means by a mass elite. One of the interesting examples is he talks about graduate nurses, and sort of said, you know, do we really need to turn nursing into such an academic job? Well, nursing is where all these issues about care, about our ignorance, about our romanticization, our idealization, our feminization, all coalesce around nursing. Why is it a deeply interesting job is dominated by something like 88% women? And that is because they grew out of a culture in which they were respected to be the handmaid of the doctor, they were allowed no independent authority, and they certainly weren't allowed to make judgments. And it's been a long, long struggle for nurses to escape that gilded cage and demand forms of authority, which we now know from extensive research that the better trained, the better qualified your nurses are, the better the safety of patients and the better the health outcomes. So nursing is a very, very interesting example. And interestingly also, nursing is a very interesting area of social mobility. Women will go into nursing maybe as nursing assistants. discover they've got a bit of a skill for it, and can be trained up, and they can end up graduating. A very brilliant nurse that I shadowed in a hospital had followed exactly that route. She'd been a retail worker, and somebody had noticed that she was good with people, suggested she went to a hospital and started working there. And now she was a staff nurse in charge of a ward. Is she one of the mass elite because she's now got a university degree?
Yeah.
I just don't buy this kind of categorization. So that's, you know, a fairly kind of fundamental kind of difficulty with what David is saying. I felt that there was also areas where I both found it fascinating. He's trying to think about dignity and status. I think these are really, really important subjects. And they do have a relationship with the sort of resentment that we see driving populism. I'm just not sure I bought his argument that, you know, the kind of 50% or whatever who don't get to university are sitting around deeply resentful of educated professionals. You know,
Lovely.
I don't really think it maps out like that. You know, when I look at my in-laws who live in Derbyshire, none of them went to university. They're not really bothered about university. But they are bothered about career progression, and they are bothered about decent incomes. And that's to them what status is about. Now, that is the root of the problem about recruitment and retention in social care and in nursing.
Yeah.
It's about the very low levels of pay. It's about that if you go into care work, you're going to be stuck there. There's no career progression. And I also think that there are the kind of issues which are around the routinization of care work and the loss of autonomy. A care worker is usually linked by technology to various types of sort of monitoring. And the minute that they step over their allotted time in a particular setting, the alarms are going off. They cannot make that decision that they need to stay with an elderly person.
Great. Madeleine, we're going to run out of time. People aren't going to have time to ask questions. Do you mind? Can we wind up there? Thank you very much. That really useful. Although I think you've misunderstood me in some places. I'll come back on that later. Nick, are you there?
I am here. I'll try not to cut out. I was going to say I personally don't want to spend too much time doing things like debating the overlaps between things like head, hand, and heart. So, you know, of course, it's true that, you know, anywheres can be somewheres, and of course, it's true that it takes some head and some heart to have what might be a largely hand occupation. But I think the point about this kind of intellectual branding is that it conveys a message. It's not necessarily about the exactitude of the boundaries between them. The point is about the distinction between anywheres and somewheres, and between head, heart, and hand, actually does matter, regardless of the precise definitions, in terms of this kind of quest for dignity and recognition, which is at the heart of a lot of the problems that I think Western societies have at the moment. I mean, I think the book speaks to me a bit, so I've quite often wondered about how I'm kind of weirdly lucky to have been born exactly when I was, because I'm functionally useless. I'm really bad at doing the kind of practical things that are expected of me in the house or with the car. I've got no sense of direction. And I'd like to think that my heart is in the right place, but I certainly wouldn't trust me to, you know, look after my nan in a care home or something like that. So if I'd been born 100 years earlier, I'd have probably ended up in one of Birmingham's little workshops. And because I'm inept, I'd have probably ended up very junior and badly paid. And if I were born 100 years later, then there'll probably be artificial intelligence machines capable of writing my newspaper column and writing election-losing manifestos on their own. But because I was born in 1980, and because I had the family I had, I went to a good school and so on, I somehow get treated by society like I'm one of life's winners. Because the moral framework of society treats people with these sort of qualifications and careers that are based on cognitive ability like we're somehow morally better. In my case, better than my grandparents and better than my parents and many of my contemporaries. But of course, like all of that is nonsense. But I do think it's very relevant to the political and social problems that we have today. It's it's sheer good fortune to be born with one set of abilities as opposed to another, or at a point in history that values those abilities more than another, or in a particular place that will allow you to make the most of them. I don't think that's a new insight, but it's one that's become more more important, and probably feels more radical because of the myth of meritocracy that has grown up in the West. And that myth is based on two flaws. So first, you don't just make it because you're more talented and harder working than others. You might have talent, you might work hard, but your success is also down to the good fortune that you were born with, in terms of the character traits that you might have that other people might not, but also that you're born a member of something bigger, which is a society and an economy that produces all the things that you rely on as somebody who maybe sort of makes things and sells them, or sells services, or or consumes things that obviously you couldn't bring together yourself. But also, like, if your success was fair, even if you could have the perfect functioning meritocracy, and to quote Michael Young, if intelligence plus effort really did equal merit, that still wouldn't be a good society, because a good society requires a conception of the common good, and to achieve the common good, we need a kind of dignity and mutual respect of knowing that all of us are valued and we're all contributing members of our communities. I'd say that's reason enough to be alone by the thrust of David's arguments. But even if you don't agree with what I said about the common good, I still think there's a reason to think this book is really important and to heed what he says. Even if you're a Tory who sees the world in a sort of liberal and individualistic way, you can surely see we're now at a point, thanks to globalization, trade, technology, that a minority of people doing head jobs can't subsidize and sustain the needs of a neglected and disrespected majority, nor can it fund a lot of the kind of care jobs in the public sector. But in fact, thanks to the kind of arrogance of the supposedly meritocratic mentality, a lot of those people doing head jobs would refuse to subsidize and sustain the rest of society anyway. And if you're a social democrat and think about things in a more of a sort of Rawlsian way, you should also listen, I think, because the status quo, I think, is increasingly killing off the idea that the rich and the successful should be able to earn what they can, if only they're prepared to redistribute some of their gains. And this isn't just because the rich is increasingly sticking two fingers up at the rest of society, but because the rest of us are increasingly unwilling to take the few breadcrumbs that are just thrown in our direction. People across society want respect and dignity. And so to me, this is why it's so important, because basically this is one of the main reasons why we've created a society of such extreme divides, and we can't just try to educate our way to a bigger and richer knowledge economy. It's not to build a better meritocracy, but it's to fundamentally revisit the kind of society we are.
Thank you, Nick. Look, we got half an hour or so. Could you, by the way, another request for anybody that wants to make a comment or ask a question? Could you use this? There's some Zoom function. There's a hand. You can press some. Yeah, you can press a hand symbol, I think, on your computer. Let me just. Can I just? As it is about my book, can I just respond to some of those comments? Perhaps working backwards, as it were, from what Nick was just saying. Just briefly, I didn't really talk about meritocracy in my opening remarks. I mean, my book is part of a whole recent spate of books that have been very hostile to meritocracy, mainly coming from the left. I mean, meritocracy, I think, if you kind of look at the recent history of meritocracy, it was a kind of idea. Obviously, it's been around forever in one form or another, but as a sort of as a political idea with some force. I think it sort of became something the left took up after they'd adapted themselves to much of the right's political economy after the 1980s. So it was then that you started, New Labour, the New Democrats started sort of talking about meritocracy and social mobility more enthusiastically, in a way that hadn't really been true with traditional socialists, for example. And one of the obvious reasons for the disillusionment with meritocracy now is that we've had, a partial version of it now for 30 or 40 years, and it's proved to be very flawed and very partial. So the left has kind of lost faith in it. You've got, Daniel Markovitz's book, The Meritocracy Trap. You've got the Michael Sandel book that's just come out, and several others. And my book is sort of perhaps part of that, although I guess I differ somewhat from some of those other books. I mean, obviously the data is there. I mean, the meritocracy is only very partially working, as I say. I mean, what's the extraordinary stat that Sandel comes up with, that the 1%, kids from the highest 1% income families in the US, more kids go to Ivy League universities from the top 1% than from the entire bottom 50%. We have similar figures, not quite as extreme as that, but similar figures here about who goes to Russell University. So in that sense, it's kind of not working very well, and maybe can't work very well in free societies in which parents can hand on their privileges to their children. So in a sense, I suppose one of my answers is, well, then let's shift merit to other areas of human life, to other kinds of human aptitudes. Obviously, so I mean, much of the kind of Sandel critique ends up by just being, let's have some more social democracy. Well, I'm all for that, but we, and also the meritocratic critique kind of partially sort of collapses in on itself, because nobody, not even Michael Young, thought that we should select for the top jobs in this or any country by lottery. We want our best nuclear scientists to be running our nuclear research program. You don't want to be operated on by a surgeon who failed their medical exams. I mean, so we want meritocratic selection for jobs, particularly top jobs, but we don't want a meritocratic society. I mean, it's a real distinction, but quite a subtle one. At the lowest level, a meritocratic society is just not a particularly good ideal. A meritocratic society is one in which, it's a competition in which the most able win, and many of the others feel like failures. And that is not an ideal. It's a pragmatic labour market requirement for any well-functioning society. Anyway, just a sort of brief addendum on meritocracy. I mean, just to briefly touch on what Madeleine was saying, I'm sort of slightly surprised by some of her remarks, seeing as that much of what I wrote about care in the chapter on care actually came from talking to her. She had some very useful insights about the difficulty of measuring care, of valuing care in kind of utilitarian, achievement-oriented societies, ideas that I borrowed. I think Madeleine has and the point about head, hand, and heart, I mean, of course, these are abstractions. Of course, all jobs involve some intertwining of aptitudes relating to these three different parts of the human anatomy. And I did say, not just at the end, but at the beginning of the book, that there's an element of artificial distinction about them. But I mean, that is what, in order to help one think about things, sometimes one has to make somewhat artificial distinctions. I think the concept of, Madeleine doesn't like summers in any ways. I do go out of my way to stress that both of these worldviews are perfectly decent and legitimate. Madeleine, like a lot of people, I think, feels sort of slightly threatened by this language and shouldn't, because you're not. A mass elite is just, a much bigger version of the kind of graduate elite that existed when I went to university. It was then 7 or 8% of school leavers went, now 30 or 40% go, 35%. There's a kind of mass professional elite in Britain. I mean, it's just a sort of descriptive term. Elite is not a bad word. I think, how we... nurses are not, by the way, badly paid on the whole. But they do have quite a narrow pay band. I mean, and also I'm in favour of the graduate nurses. I think Madeleine, I mean, I do rehearse the arguments that are very popular about a lot of people are unhappy about it. I'm in favour of graduate nurses, but as nurses become quasi-doctors, there are a lot of very serious people who know what they're talking about in the care area who worry that something is lost as well. I mean, and when it comes to pay, I mean, it's not, nurses and doctors are obviously very well paid. Nurses are pretty well paid. I know somebody 3 years out of college who's on 36 grand. Admittedly, that's with some London waiting and some antisocial hours shifts. But it's social care, obviously, as we all know, that is the real Cinderella service there. I should just, finally, briefly on, Andrew's points about, of course, everybody wants to go to university because that is what, that is part of the point of my book, is that our culture is so biased towards it, and it's so easy to do. There's a great big blinking avenue, pointing everybody in this direction. It's simple, it's highly subsidized too, even with high individual tuition fees. It's massively more subsidized than most other areas of post-school education. And so, of course, I'm surprised by your residential figure, the what's it called, HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, had a paper a few months ago that said that almost 80% of British students are residential students, much higher. I mean, we're an outlier in that respect. We're also an outlier in the fact that we have this undifferentiated higher education system. Most other countries have still versions of our old polytechnics. They have technical colleges where where there's much more flexibility, much more variety. You can do part-time courses, sandwich courses, etc. And that has disappeared. It's become a kind of all or nothing thing. Why don't I stop there? I didn't really, I kind of agreed with what you said, so.
Yeah. I'll maybe just come back very quickly on Andrew's point, which is that, yes, of course, we can argue about where on that 0 to 5 scale of autonomy driverless cars currently sit, whether at 3, 4, 5. But I think it's such a mistake to focus on a particular technology and a particular limitation and extrapolate more generally about technology. Just the fundamental trend is that our systems and machines are becoming increasingly capable, taking on tasks we thought, only human beings until recently could ever do.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that is that the impact of those technologies is unequal, and I think those impacts, as I described, affect head, hand, and heart in different ways. After all, that is how we've explained the polarization of labour markets that we've seen around the world over the last few decades.
Yeah. Just before we open it up, the other point that is kind of perhaps easily to caricature is that, of course, I'm in favour of high intelligence. We need teams of highly intelligent people to work together, and indeed their work is often made easier by the invention of the internet to discover a vaccine for the COVID-19. We need some genius to work out how to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. We need high intelligence, as a species more than ever. This is not an argument against intelligence. It's not an argument against universities as such. But we've massively overexpanded the kind of middle and lower levels of the sort of that cognitive group, if you like, people who are no more able than lots of people who don't go to university, and we've placed all of the sort of the cultural and indeed sort of financial biases towards university when we should be spreading it out more, because not everybody, we obviously want the most academically capable kids to go to elite universities, and we need that. It's absolutely clear. Particularly post-Brexit Britain will have to live off its wits as never before. But actually we don't need many of the kind of lower levels, or rather the kinds of work that the kind of studying that people do. Often they forget about everything they've learned at university within about 5 seconds. Anyway, you can have just as satisfying, intellectually satisfying a life, doing other kinds of work. You don't need to go down that academic route to the extent that we've encouraged kids. Anyway, let's have some comments. We got about 20 minutes. Yeah, I'm sorry we got no warm white wine, as somebody has pointed out. This is one of the sad things about COVID, book launches under COVID conditions. So Mercy. Question from Mercy Marocchi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello, thank you. That was really interesting, and I haven't read the book yet, but I had a question. I'm sitting on the government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, and I'm quite interested in the racial dimension and the ethnic dimension of all these things you're talking about. I mean, we know that, for instance, just on something you were saying, David, Black kids are massively overrepresented at low tariff universities. There's lots of, I think 1 in 3 Black female graduates go into nursing. So there's lots of things you're touching on that have a strong ethnic dimension. And I just wondered if you could kind of highlight some of the kind of your top observations or findings that you think are most pertinent to ethnicity based on what you kind of talked about in your book.
Yes, I think ethnic minority Brits go to university in a higher proportion than kids or people from the majority population, and that is that's true for most groups at the Russell Group universities as well. Although not for Black students, I think Black students are slightly underrepresented at the Russell Group universities, but I do think this point. This point about sort of disappointed expectations, I think, can overlap with a kind of race story, and where it may not be race that is actually really the issue. I mean, you've got a whole, you've got a significant proportion of the new graduate class who, for some of the reasons that me and Daniel have been talking about, even before AI really starts to kick in, are already doing relatively routinized kind of clerical administrative jobs, the kind of jobs that their non-graduate parents might well have done. And that isn't kind of what they expected. They feel, I did what I was told to do. I worked hard at school. I went to college, and I'm now in this back office job, paying 22 grand a year. And I think this can, perhaps particularly if you're an ethnic minority kid, you have a kind of racism narrative that you can grasp and say, it's because British society is unfair to me because I'm Black or brown. Whereas actually what is happening is that we've got a massive misalignment of what the education system is producing and what the economy actually needs. And I suppose one of the reasons why I guess you tend to get higher proportions of ethnic minority kids going to university. Indeed, one of the reasons why the cognitive meritocracy is as big as it is, and why it is because it feels fair. It's easier to measure. This is one of the points that indeed I learned sort of from Madeleine about care. Cognitive type jobs seem to be fair because you have to pass an exam. It's sort of objective, and therefore forms of prejudice that might be out there are less overt or fall away. You get as far as your talents, or so it seems. Obviously that certain groups of people have more advantages. They may have private tutors. They come from certain kinds of homes that are going to encourage you in certain aptitudes and certain directions. But I think that perhaps that is why you get this disproportionate number of ethnic minority kids at universities, because it seems to be a sort of a route to safety, and then when it turns out not to be, or not to the kind of safety that people had imagined, there is perhaps a particularly sharp disappointment sets in. Next question from Bobby Vedral. or comment, if I know Bobby.
No, quick question. Thanks, David.
Hi, Bobby.
A quick question for Lord Adonis, because as a German, it's quite entertaining to.
There's a lot of background noise there, Bobby. Are you having a party?
No, there's just sorry, people speaking behind me. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
So,
more or less. Just speak up a bit.
Yeah. So basically, there's a question to Lord Adonis to the point of. From a German perspective, where roughly 50% of our young go to apprenticeship, because obviously our apprenticeships are highly technical. They operate machines, they are solar panel technicians, nuclear technicians, or when you look at Japan, where obviously they don't let immigration in, the healthcare is highly robotized, highly skilled care workers, who correspondingly also earn a lot. The problem in Britain is just doesn't exist. There is no real apprenticeship system here if you want to go down that route. So it's a bit unfair to compare, because obviously people here prefer to go to universities because there is no alternative. So my question is, what does he think would be a way to change that? Or is that just, it is as it is, and it just never takes a root in Britain? So what would he do in order to create this, the opportunity in the first place, so that people can even choose between academic or skilled education?
Was Andrew able to hear that? Is Andrew there?
I did hear it, and
yeah.
I am here, but I'm sort of slightly hesitant to speak, because I think I got lost in mid-flow last time, didn't I? You actually
We'll give it a try. Come on.
Okay, let me start. First of all, can I say I don't think that there's any link between deprioritising higher education and giving more priority to apprenticeships. I think they're entirely separate issues, and that's the bit of interpretation where I think David and I disagree. I don't think that we're more likely to tackle the apprenticeship deficit, which is a definite deficit, which we have in Britain, by deprioritising education, higher education. On the contrary, I think what we need to do is start deploying more linkages between higher level apprenticeships and universities, which of course is what used to happen with the HND system. And what we failed to do, it's not in our stars, it's not cultural, it's nothing like that. It's a failure of government-led reform over the last two generations to build on the HND and to have much more intensive links between apprenticeship routes into
but
industry.
Andrew,
and,
but Andrew, you cannot say that. You have gone for a different route. You've gone for 50% of school leavers going to college. The reason why HNDs and HNCs, hundreds of thousands of people used to do them, the people that used to do those are now going to university. Now, they're often doing vocational courses, but they're academicized courses. And this is a direct product of the policies that you helped to implement.
Sorry, it's slightly difficult to know. I mean, they always were going to higher education. HNDs always were a higher education level. They went and they did the HND component for the most part in polytechnics.
Yeah.
So there isn't a great before and after. The two things that have happened, unfortunately, well, there's a third thing that happened, of course, which is unfortunately a large part of manufacturing industry was simply destroyed in the 1980s. So the opportunities to go down this route were reduced because we didn't have the industrial base that the Germans have got, which necessitated the production of these engineers. So there's a separate thing going on too. But there's nothing incompatible with having 50% going through a higher education route, including many of them going through a technical.
So long as it's more differentiated, so long as they're doing HND and HNC type things, but they're not at the moment. They're doing 3-4 year construction management courses, lots of general business studies bollocks. I mean, it's the over-academicization of these things.
You're starting to sound a bit like Melanie Phillips, David. That's not actually that isn't actually what goes on in universities. What goes on in universities now is still a lot. I mean, it's not enough of it. So I'm sort of half agreeing with you, as I always do. It's my golden rule with David. I half agree with him. We don't have enough of the higher level applied apprenticeships with a strong higher education routes, which links, like the University of Warwick with its manufacturing centre. I could go through a whole list of institutions that links with real businesses providing real jobs. We don't have enough of it, but we do have those routes, and they need to be expanded.
All right,
but on this point about why we don't have a strong enough apprenticeship route, the reason we don't have a strong enough apprenticeship route in this country is because almost all of the energy of the states in the last two generations, when it's come to reforming the education system beyond the age of 60. Almost all of the energy of the state has gone into reforming universities. There's been a serious higher education reform bill, including a complete reconstitution of the financial basis of universities every parliament now for the last 20 years. And what's needed, and
this goes back to your point earlier. I mean, this is because all the politicians are now graduates, all of their children go to universities, so it's the world they know, it's the world they care about. Anyway, we've got to move on now. We've got to move on because I want to get into some more questions. Baroness Tina Stowell. Baroness?
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Yes, it's Tina Stoll here. Following on from Andrew as another member of the House of Lords. I am picking up actually on your point about most politicians being having gone through the university route. I'm probably one of the few people who has arrived at a role which is very much a head role. I was leader of the House of Lords, but started my career very much in a hand occupation. I went through a technical education and didn't go through to university. And I haven't yet had a chance to read your book, but it raises a lot of issues which I feel very strongly about and which matter to me a lot and which I have raised over the last few years. And I think what's really critical is for those of us, particularly in head roles, to understand that there is, more than one version of intelligence worthy of respect. And I think that, what is, I think it was Nick who said about the importance of mutual respect. And I think I can't emphasize enough that for a lot of people who have not gone through the university route, the contribution that they are making, their own definition of success is incredibly valuable and worthwhile. What they're looking for is the kind of respect for what it is that they bring to any kind of endeavour as those who are sort of more academically credentialed. And actually the effort and the work that they have gone into creating their own version of success is understood and valued and recognised as an important factor, which would lead to even more riches for more people to be able to enjoy and take advantage of. So it was a comment rather than a question, but I'm very much looking forward to reading your book in detail, and thank you very much for today's discussion.
Good one. Thank you very much. David Nussbaum?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. David, I haven't read your book, is the first confession.
Right.
Let me ask, it feels as if it's a rather UK or Anglo-American, North American perspective. My particular question is, if you take a society like India, do you think they'll have to go through the same process, the same balance between head, hand and heart, or will they jump to a different model, maybe driven by technology? We heard about AI. How do you see this playing out more internationally, globally, in countries that don't have the same social?
That's a really interesting question. It's true. My book is I mean it's written mainly from a British perspective, but it is I talk quite a lot about the US. I talk quite a lot about Germany, which I know reasonably well. I talk quite a lot about France. Perhaps not coincidentally, because the book is also being published in the US, Germany, and France. And I think many of the problems that I'm talking about are particularly acute in Anglo-America. The massive expansion, in my view, over-expansion of higher education, the kind of shrinkage of the allocation of reward and prestige, so much on sort of information manipulation type jobs, and many of these issues are, as Bobby from Germany was just saying, many of these issues are less acute. If 50% of school leavers do an apprenticeship, it kind of inherently, and lots of middle class and even upper middle class German kids do apprenticeships, completely normal, and there's much more of a kind of equal status across different kind of functions. I mean, what were you saying about I don't know, India, African countries, whether they can, sort of a bit like the kind of mobile phone revolution. They can kind of, they can leap a stage and perhaps learn from our mistakes. I mean, at the moment, I was talking to somebody the other day from the Commonwealth Universities Association who was saying that actually a lot of countries in Africa have gone down our kind of route, trying to create mass higher education, finding that they're, as we are, I mean, actually lacking people who can, be technicians in labs or can, help the academic engineer with actually build a bridge. They're missing out the kind of vital, sort of middle level skills in a lot of areas, and that they're rather regressing having followed our route. I mean, I guess I hope that that I mean, I think it's, this is a very complicated and subtle thing. I mean, I think as I say, obviously all societies need, highly intelligent people, and they need institutions where their intelligence can be nurtured. It's when you sort of get, it's when other people of kind of, like most of us, people of kind of more average ability, as it were, pass themselves off, or rather they attach themselves to the prestige of the very sort of highest levels of cognitive ability, when actually it isn't necessarily the best thing for them, and it's not necessarily, economically or indeed culturally functional for their societies. And I mean, I hope that I don't know whether the Chinese model kind of will provide a kind of alternative. I mean, they certainly seem very, very keen on higher education, and sending so many of their mainly more elite kids to our universities or American universities still seems to be roaring ahead. Interesting observation. Another question from Ken Charman, who was involved in, I interviewed for the book about various subjects. Ken, are you there?
I am, David. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. As you know, I have read the book. Yeah. So
yeah.
And I stand guilty as charged. Yeah. So I'm in a senior position in HR and reward. I'm at that place where we allocate these luxuries to people, and I'm absolutely convinced that we have allowed reward and status to flood up, and we should have had it trickling down. But having got to this position, how do we unravel, and can we do it without government regulation, which remains taboo across all the parties? Everybody wants voluntary movements in these sort of things. My own opinion is we won't work without government forcing business and organisations to suppress high pay and allocate more down the hierarchy. So will we ever see government regulation in a society like our own?
I think we will. I mean, I think we live in, we already have relatively high minimum wages. I mean, I think we could probably do, we could probably tax, some of the kind of sort of windfall, windfall incomes that some people in the organisations that you work for are receiving. I mean, we've just got to make it uncomfortable for people to be earning so much more. What is it? The CEO's earning 192 times more than the average employee in a company. I mean, these sort of grotesque things. I mean, I think the cultural pressure to reduce those sorts of ratios will be quite strong, and government can do it in other ways too. I mean, the way that people, intellectual property rights, and allow people to sort of accumulate super profits from their often their good fortune in a way. But I think I think some of this is happening anyway, and I think I think particularly the sort of shift away from the cognitive as the main source of esteem. I mean, you're seeing it already in, I mean, contrary to what Andrew was saying, I mean, the surveys show that, you know, up to a third of graduates do feel dissatisfied, actually, with their experience of university. You get, you know, more and more kind of columnists, and politics itself is sort of reflecting this shift. You know, people are sort of saying, you know, why not take up an entrepreneurial role when you leave school, or, you know, an artisanal role? These things are becoming, I think we're getting more sort of variety in the kind of work that is respected and reasonably well paid. So I think at some level, and as I said, I mean, status is not in the gift of politicians to distribute. I mean, they can help to create a climate in which these things can change. And it's people like you, Ken. You know, you're a key figure in a big organisation, and as you've often told me, I mean, there are lots of people who think like you. So, you know, and things can change very quickly often. And after all, you know, I mean, the business plans of big corporations have been hugely impacted in recent years by issues of, say, gender equality, or, you know, public concern about the environment, massively. And so why shouldn't they also be hugely affected by these concerns? Have we got one more? We haven't got one more. That, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid, is that. Anyway, thank you all. For those of you who have lasted the course, that is, thank you all for hanging around. Apologies for some of the perhaps unavoidable technical hiccups. Thank you to Daniel. Thank you to the other panelists, Madeleine, Andrew, and Nick. And thank you, everybody who asked questions. And I hope you do, those of you who haven't read the book, I hope you do buy it and enjoy it, and by all means contact me and with your thoughts, critical thoughts, welcome too. Thank you very much.